On behalf of the Institute of Politics, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's forum. It's one of our very special events that we have each year to honor the late President John F. Kennedy, after whom this school is named. And I'm very proud to say the Institute of Politics is the living memorial for the President. The Institute is designed to try to inspire young people to become engaged in politics and public service. We often find that the politicians and leaders who come to visit and meet with our students are the ones who take away the inspiration from those students, and so I think the Institute provides a service in two directions. But we're very pleased today to have several people in our audience with us that we want to quickly recognize. Delighted that Dean Joseph Nye of the Kennedy School is here with us today. Dean Nye. And a pillar in the Harvard community, Angelica Zander Rudenstein, is with us this afternoon. We're also very pleased to welcome Caroline Kennedy and Ed Schlossberg. We have, the name of our forum, as you well know, is the Medicare Debate, Then and Now, and it will be moderated by John F. Kennedy, whom we're very pleased is a member of the Senior Advisory Board of the Institute of Politics, and we want to welcome Senator Kennedy as well, who is a member of the board of the Senior Advisory Board of the Institute of Politics. Both give considerable time to our students and to our activities, and have been an inspiration in both. The senator, as we know, has long been known as one of the most influential senators in the U.S. Senate, increasingly is known as the influential senator in the Senate. The topic today is about Medicare, but his most recent work on child health received considerable attention when he joined up with Senator Hatch. And the day after he made that announcement, he was in the forum here explaining that less than 6 weeks ago. The Senate has already had a vote on it. For most other members of the Congress, a vote that was not totally successful would be seen as a disaster at this point. When it comes to Senator Kennedy, everybody knows that's just the starting point. They better get ready because this is going to become law. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, let me welcome John Kennedy.
Thank you, Phil. I want to thank the Institute of Politics for arranging this forum on what would have been President Kennedy's 80th birthday. I also, before we begin, want to say a few words about a special guest we have in our audience today. This morning, my uncle and Caroline and I gave the Profiles in Courage Award to Judge Charles Price, who is seated here. And if you may just stand, Judge. It was Judge Price's decision regarding a judge in Alabama who hung a copy of the Ten Commandments in his courtroom and began each court session with a prayer. Judge Price found that since it was hung there expressly for religious purposes, that it was prescribed by the Constitution, and that case is going up to the Alabama Supreme Court and possibly to the United States Supreme Court. But this is a wonderful tradition that we've developed here. My father was proud of his close and special ties to Harvard, and he maintained them throughout his years in public service. He believed in a close relationship between scholarship and public policy, and he used it to appeal to the best of our ideals in this country. My family is especially proud of the School of Government. It's probably the memorial that my father would have loved best because it combines both his love of government with his love of public service. This topic of this year's forum was of great importance to President Kennedy's administration. He believed deeply in Medicare. He fought for it in the Senate. He made it the centerpiece of his presidential campaign, despite the opposition of the American Medical Association. And I'm sure that he would have viewed its enactment as one of the greatest gifts to the nation. Thanks to a short film prepared by the Library for the Forum, we'll get to take a look at President Kennedy advocating for Medicare, both as a candidate and as a president. Despite Medicare's many successes, it faces significant problems in adapting to current and long-term pressures. Following the film, I will introduce the distinguished panel that we have gathered here to discuss all of these issues. We begin now with a short film. I just wanted to, so people understood the narrative structure. The film opens with 3 spots from the 1960 campaign. One of him talking with an elderly man in West Virginia, the other a Kennedy campaign ad, and the other a clip from the Kennedy-Nixon debate in Chicago. Then you'll see clips, President Kennedy talking about Medicare in a presidential press conference, and finally a speech at a rally for medical care for the elderly in New York in 1962. The film is about 12 minutes in length, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
I had a hospital, was there 17 days, cost me $650. I think we ought to have a plan that will help the old people out.
His problem is one shared by so many others. Senator Kennedy discusses this problem with Mr. Sanders.
I think that the best plan to do would be, through the Social Security system, receive assistance in the payment of your medical bills, hospitalization, all the examinations, and all the rest. Well, I think that this Congress ought to do it. I don't think we ought to wait to another administration. I think it ought to be done this year. And I must say, as Vice Chairman of the Committee on Aging of the Senate, I don't think that there's a problem that's more serious for the 14, 15 million people who are over 65, many of them with their incomes down and with their health gone, who face an overwhelming problem in paying for their bills. One of the problems which concerns me most is our failure to meet the problem of medical care for our older citizens. Some of them are in ill health. Some of them are in your family. And yet under present laws, before they can receive any assistance in the payment of their medical bills, which may be expensive, they must take a pauper's oath. They must say that they are medically indigent. I believe that the way to meet this problem is the way Franklin Roosevelt met it in the Social Security Act of 1935. I believe that people during their working years would want to contribute so that when they retired, when they reached the age of 65 for men or 62 for women, then they can receive assistance in paying their bills. They pay their own way. They live in dignity. They get protection. This is the way it ought to be done. This is the sound way.
Here are some revealing excerpts from the great debate. The subject under discussion was recent Democratic legislation.
The reason why these particular bills in these various fields that have been mentioned were not passed was not because the president was against them. It was because the people were against them. It was because they were too extreme.
Well, now let's look at these bills that the Vice President suggests were too extreme. One was a bill for $1.25 an hour for anyone who works in a store or a company that has $1 million a year business. I don't think that's extreme at all. Secondly was the Federal Aid to Education bill. It was not an extreme bill, and yet we could not get one Republican to join. The third is medical care for the aged, which is tied to Social Security, which is financed out of Social Security funds. I think it shows the difference between the two parties. One party is ready to move in these programs, the other party gives them lip service.
Americans want to move ahead with new leadership. Let's elect John F. Kennedy president.
Being used for military purposes.
Mr. President, the critics of your medical care plan have charged that this will be the opening wedge for socialized medicine in this country. Would you care to comment on that, sir?
Well, it's an old argument when a case is lost to argue that it's all right here, but what's it going to mean for the future? Under that argument, there wouldn't have been any progress on any social legislation in this country. That was the argument that was used against the Social Security Act in the 30s. It's the argument used against the minimum wage. It's the argument used against any agricultural program. It is the oldest argument in the world. The fact of the matter is, this is a useful program. It is developed for a special purpose. And in my judgment, it's going to be adopted. I believe it has a good chance this year, if not in the future, and it's in the economic as well as the social interest of the people of our country. But to say I'm against this because in a future date somebody else may do something, it doesn't seem to me to be a rational argument, and it was the kind of argument which was successfully defeated on many occasions during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah. And then other people say, why doesn't the government mind its own business? What is the government's business is the question. Harry Truman said that 14 million Americans had enough resources so that they could hire people in Washington to protect their interests, and the rest of them depended upon the President of the United States and others. This bill serves the public interest. It involves the government because it involves the public welfare. The Constitution of the United States did not make the President or the Congress powerless. It gave them definite responsibilities to advance the general welfare, and that is what we're attempting to do. And then I read that this bill will sap the individual self-reliance of Americans. I can't imagine anything worse or anything better to sap someone's self-reliance than to be sick, alone, broke, or to have saved for a lifetime and put it out in a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. I visited twice yesterday and once today, a hospital where doctors labor for a long time to visit my father. It isn't easy. It isn't easy. He can pay his bills, but otherwise I would be. And I'm not as well off as he is.
Mr. President, could you tell us what you thought of the American Medical Association's reply on Monday night to your proposals, your speech on Sunday about medical care? And also, could you tell us what sort of reaction you have had so far in the White House to the two television speeches, yours on Sunday and the American Medical?
Well, I read the statement, and I gathered they were opposed to it. The thing that the statement, the description of our bill, I did not recognize. Now, I think that the American people know quite well what this problem is. There isn't anyone in the United States who will not have or who has not already had a case of a parent who is sick for a long period of time with a burden falling very heavily upon either them, on their savings, or upon their children. This bill would particularly help those who have some savings and who nevertheless find themselves hard hit, or their children who have some savings and find themselves faced with these large bills, which in the short space of 1, 2, and 3 and 4 months can run up into several thousands of dollars. So that I feel that the AMA may not oppose this bill, may not support this bill, but I think the American people will, and I think more and more doctors are supporting it. And I think it's extremely important legislation.
Speaking generally about your legislative program, Mr. President, do you feel that it's had the degree of, the proper degree of support from the Democratic majorities in the House and Senate?
No, we haven't gotten the legislative program. I don't think we ought to go home till we get a good deal more of it by. And I think that's the wishes of the majority. We should realize that some Democrats have voted with the Republicans for 25 years, really since 1938. And that makes it very difficult to secure the enactment of any controversial legislation. You can water bills down and get them by, or you can have bills which have no particular controversy to them and get them by. But important legislation, medical care for the aged, and these other bills, farm programs, they're controversial. They involve great interest, and they're much more difficult. Now, the second matter is to urge strong support for the Senate effort, which is now going forward under the leadership of Senator Anderson, to pass a medical care for the aged bill under Social Security. The bill which is now coming before the Senate is a strong bill. It meets the problems of those who have been not covered by Social Security. It provides participation by the Blue Cross, by private insurance companies. It's an effective bill, and I think could mean a good deal to our older citizens and their children who must sustain them. I hope the Senate will act, and then the House.
Mr. President, concerning the Medicare bill, would you elaborate on why you don't favor inclusion of doctors' fees? Is it a matter of legislative strategy or of philosophy?
I think that the doctors are very strong against being included. They feel that this would involve the government in the doctor-patient relationship, and therefore we have concentrated our efforts in attempting to assist people to pay their bills, hospital bills, and quite obviously if they find that eased, they'll be in a better position to work out their relationship with their doctors. It is because we have not included doctors that I've found it very difficult to understand why the American Medical Association has found this legislation so unsatisfactory. It does not involve them directly. It involves the payment of hospital bills. And in view of the fact that the federal government participates in the construction of hospitals through the Hill-Burton Act, from which doctors benefit in their practice, I've found the AMA's extreme hostility to this bill somewhat incomprehensible.
The other day, after the Medicare vote, you said that a handful of Democrats voted against you. There were 21. This prompts two questions. Wasn't it a pretty big handful?
Yes.
And B, won't this tend to inhibit you in setting this forth as an issue?
No, over 2/3 of the Democrats voted for it. A third of the Democrats voted against it. About 6/7 or 7/8 of the Republicans voted against it. So that this combination of almost total Republican opposition with a third of the Democrats defeated us by 52 to 48. Now, the issue in November, every seat that is being contested between Republicans and Democrats, really, in I would say 80% or 90% of the cases, will be between those who oppose Medicare and those who are for it. So that there isn't any doubt that there is, in a party as large as the Democratic Party, those who do not support a good many of the programs. The alliances may change, but of course we lose a third or a fourth, and we have since 1938. But the fact of the matter is this administration is for Medicare, and 2/3 of the Democrats are for Medicare, and 7/8 of the Republicans are against it. And that seems to me to be the issue. I have sent to the Congress today a message on the needs of our 17.5 million senior citizens. The number of people in this country aged 65 and over increases by 1,000 every day as science prolongs the lifespan. But it's not enough for a great nation merely to add to the years of lives. Our object also must be to add new life to those years. My most important recommendation is a revised hospital insurance program senior citizens under Social Security. Only 10 to 15% of the health costs of senior citizens today are reimbursed by private insurance. Hospital costs have quadrupled since the war and now average more than $35 a day. And since a great many retired workers have little more than $70 a month on Social Security, prospects of the usual 2 or 3 bouts in the hospital after age 65 confronts them with an impossible choice. They either have to ask their children or grandchildren to undergo financial hardship or accept poverty and charity themselves or suffer their illness in silence. I think this nation can do better than that. This cooperation between an alert and progressive citizenry and a progressive government is what has made this country great, and we shall continue as long as we have the opportunity to do so. We've got great unfinished business in this country. And while this bill does not solve our problems in this area, I do not believe it is a valid argument to say this bill isn't going to do the job. It will not. But it will do part of it. Our housing bill last year for the elderly, that won't do the job, but it will begin. When we retrain workers, that won't take care of unemployment chronically in some areas, but it's a start. We aren't able overnight to solve all the problems that this country faces. But is that any good reason why we should say, let's not even try? That's what we're going to do today. We are trying. We are trying. And what we're talking about here is true in a variety of other ways. All the great revolutionary movements of the Franklin Roosevelt administration in the 30s we now take for granted. But I refuse to see us live on the accomplishments of another generation. I refuse to see this country and all of us shrink from these struggles, which are our responsibility in our time, because what we are now talking about in our children's day will seem to be the ordinary business of government.
just wanted to recognize another distinguished guest in the audience, a man who was an advisor to President Kennedy on civil rights, a former senator from Pennsylvania, and now currently the chairman of President Clinton's National Commission on Voluntary Service, Senator Wofford. Horace Wofford. Our first panelist is Bob Ball. Bob rose through the civil service to become Commissioner of Social Security under President Kennedy, and he's one of the country's most respected thinkers on the future of both Medicare and Social Security, and a wise counselor to Democrats and Republicans alike. Most recently, he was the leader of the Advisory Council on Social Security and crafted a widely praised plan to deal with the current challenges facing the program and keep it strong for the future. Bob Ball. If you want to, you can stay here and go ahead and wander up.
Thank you very much. I was asked to do some reminiscing about the early days of Medicare, and I may be starting that a little too late. As Mark Twain said, when I was younger, I could remember everything, whether it was true or not. But I remember a lot. The problem is how to pick out for you what's most significant. And perhaps a key word will anchor the story. The guiding principle for the legislative proposal was pragmatism. What could get congressional support and what would work? By 1960, when John F. Kennedy made Medicare one of his most important issues of the campaign, he adopted a plan that had been carefully shaped by political pragmatism over a considerable period. And after his election, this again was the guiding principle. What provisions would attract the most support and be the least vulnerable to attack? In fact, this is why the plan covered only the elderly. At first, it seems difficult to understand that with no experience with health insurance, the United States would choose to start a program with the most difficult group administratively. And the elderly were also, of course, by far the most costly. Hospital admissions would be more frequent, stays would be longer, and much more often than other age groups, the patients would have multiple illnesses, and after expensive treatment, would often nevertheless die. And they were not a very good investment in terms of length of life ahead, even if they recovered. As a society, it would seem to have made more sense, if we were going to start with an age group at all, to start with children. After the first year of life, children do not need expensive care very often, and the investment, of course, can make a difference over a long lifetime ahead. And with Senator Kennedy's leadership, it looks as if we're going to get children at last. So why the elderly? Pragmatism is again the answer. President Kennedy had a Democratic Congress in name only. The balance of power was held by conservative Democrats, mostly from the South. And in the House, any legislation had to attract 40 or 50 votes that could be counted, but could not be counted on as part of the Democratic mainstream. Covering the elderly just seemed to have the best chance of support. The elderly were an appealing group to cover in part because they were so ill-suited for coverage by voluntary private insurance. They used on average more than twice as many hospital days as younger people, and on average they had about half the income. So that private insurance, which set premiums year by year to cover current costs, had to charge the elderly much more than others, and the elderly couldn't afford the charges. The result was that somewhat less than half of the elderly had any kind of hospital insurance, and what they had was inadequate, typically paying so much a day for a limited number of days, usually much less than half coverage. So the need of the elderly for health insurance was not hard to prove, nor was it difficult to prove that voluntary individual insurance was not only not meeting the need, but that it really could not. The design of the proposal was pragmatic, and the goals were limited. At the time of the 1960 campaign, only hospital care was included, and only for those over 65. Although the bill once covered Social Security beneficiaries of all ages, and in-hospital surgery, it no longer did. It was felt that if the bill avoided physician services, as you heard President Kennedy say in the clip, the very strong opposition of the AMA should have had less standing since they were not directly involved. This was not a proposal to reform the healthcare delivery system. It aimed only to assure that the same level of care would be available to the elderly and under Medicaid, the poor, as was already enjoyed by insured patients of younger ages. It avoided disrupting the status quo to the extent possible. Thus, the bill followed the principles of reimbursement that hospitals all over the country had negotiated with Blue Cross. Government was to be unobtrusive. Hospitals would be allowed to nominate an intermediary to do the actual work of bill payment and to be the contact point with hospitals. The carrot for the hospitals was, of course, that bills that had previously gone unpaid would now be paid, and they were promised a very light regulatory hand. Now, even this modest, politically pragmatic bill had a very hard time. In broad outline, it was first advanced, get this date, in 1952, and it took until 1965 for it to become law. And even when it started, it was a backup bill because those of us who supported universal health insurance had been discouraged about getting the whole thing. President Truman endorsed a full-scale universal health plan, but he never had the influence to get serious consideration of it. Either when he was filling out the fourth term of President Roosevelt, or when, much to everyone's surprise but his own, he got reelected in his own right. But faced with both houses of Congress in Republican control, his ideas went nowhere. And that's really why we backed up to a plan like Medicare. And then the Eisenhower administration, which of course controlled the executive branch, for 8 years after Truman was completely opposed to the idea of Medicare. So it took the election of John F. Kennedy to fully develop a practical medical proposal and to push it to the very edge of adoption. In the Kennedy administration, the push for Medicare was carried out on two tracks. There was intense behind-the-scenes negotiations with congressional leaders, particularly Wilbur Mills, the conservative chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. This was one track, and for the most part was in charge of Wilbur Cohen and the people who worked with him, such as myself. And the key times, of course, were the intervention of the president. Cohen was a legendary negotiator and compromiser. He was known as a salami slicer. One thin piece of legislation added to another until, through several acts of Congress, you had a pretty good sandwich. The other track was the organization of public pressure. The unions, which were the main backers of health insurance, and the Democratic National Committee created a new organization of senior citizens, which is still influential, the National Council of Senior Citizens, NCSC. This group picketed enemies of the plan, such as the Reader's Digest. It held giant rallies in major cities, talked to congressmen at the grassroots, deluged Congress with mails. They organized that Madison Square Garden meeting to which the president spoke in the clip. Now, all this culminated during the Kennedy administration in a drive to get Medicare through the Senate during the summer of 1962. On July 17th, it almost happened. The strategy was to attach the Medicare amendment to a comprehensive welfare bill. The forces were closely divided, but those who opposed the administration's Medicare plan were led by Senator Robert Kerr, at that time the most powerful man in the Senate and a very skillful legislator. Medicare would have won that year, except that Kerr was able to pry one vote away from the administration. And as is not infrequent on important issues, he used something quite irrelevant to Medicare. Senator Randolph of West Virginia was a supporter of the Medicare bill and had voted for it in 1960, the last time Medicare had been before the Senate. But the welfare bill to which the Medicare amendment was attached contained one provision worth many millions of dollars to West Virginia. Without this provision, West Virginia was out of conformity with federal rules and regulations, and as a consequence, might lose large sums of money. Kerr, in charge of the overall bill, controlled whether or not the West Virginia provision would be included. And he made Randolph's vote the price of his vote against Medicare, the price of including the West Virginia provision. So the final vote was 52 to 48. If Randolph had stuck with Medicare, the vote would have been 51 to 49. But Senator Hayden of Arizona, an administrative supporter in general, but against Medicare, had pledged to vote for Medicare if this was a deciding vote. So we would have ended up with a 50-50 tie, which would have been broken by the Vice President. By such narrow margins and frequent irrelevancies are major, major issues sometimes decided. The loss of Medicare in the Senate was a big disappointment to President Kennedy, but he had brought the issue to the verge of adoption and made it possible for President Johnson, when elected in his own right, to secure passage. After years of government neglect, President Kennedy had proven once again that you could use government for the common good. And incidentally, after the Johnson landslide and it looked inevitable to have Medicare, Chairman Wilbur Mills, who had been at the end of the parade and was holding it all back, ran around in front and led the forces in the House to adopt Medicare. Now, what we hear mostly about Medicare today is the need to control costs, and that is very important. But we also need to be reminded of how much good Medicare has done. Medicare has done well what it was designed to do. Because of Medicare, hundreds of millions of older people and their sons and daughters have been better off. Not only has the cost of medical bills been made bearable, but the quality of life of the elderly has been greatly improved because of the availability of many modern medical techniques that otherwise might have been not affordable by many, many of the elderly. I think of cataract removals, artificial hips and other joints, transplants, cardiac bypasses, just to name a few, have all helped to promote greater well-being, even though not life-extending. But Medicare has also undoubtedly contributed to the fact that the United States, with Japan, leads the world in longevity from 65 on. One thing about the Medicare experience, it seems to me, is that it illustrates that in such a program, so much depends on the human factor, on how patients behave, how physicians behave, hospital administrators, insurers, and others. It is not a mechanical model we are dealing with, but one that has all the messiness that arises when real human beings are called on to run complicated, interrelated institutions that depend on human behavior. We should not be discouraged about further extensions of health insurance. We can make it work, but neither when it happens should we expect a smooth-running, purring machine. As Mark Twain said, man was made at the end of the week when God was tired.
Karen Davis is one of the country's most respected authorities on Medicare and health policy as well. She earned her PhD in economics from Rice University and went on to hold a number of distinguished academic positions. During the Carter administration, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health Policy and as head of the Health Resources Administration. Since leaving the government, she has served as chairman of the Commonwealth Fund, where she established a research agenda with a significant focus on the challenges facing the elderly, particularly with those with low income. Today, Karen's a senior advisor to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala, and President Clinton on health policy issues.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about Medicare's record of success. Medicare is a living memorial to President Kennedy's commitment to those who've given so much to their country and are repaid with decent health care and quality of life in old age. Together with Social Security, Medicare has helped lift older Americans out of poverty. It assures that no older American goes without needed health care because of inability to afford care. I was struck in the videotape by President Kennedy's remark that fear of the future is used by the opponents of Medicare and other social legislation as a reason to not move forward. That fear of the future, I think, echoes in today's current Medicare debate. You frequently hear the claim that Medicare is going bankrupt. We can't afford to pay for health care for our nation's seniors. Medicare needs to be radically changed. And it's interesting, therefore, to look at what has happened since President Kennedy made those statements. Some things have changed. Instead of 17 million older Americans that he mentioned, we now have 38 million elderly and disabled Americans covered by Medicare. The population has doubled. And Medicare has contributed to adding years to life and life to years, as President Kennedy envisioned. Life expectancy at age 65 has increased by 3 years since Medicare was enacted. And as Mr. Ball mentioned, the U.S. is a world leader in life expectancy of older adults. Technological innovations such as cataract surgery, joint replacements, advanced methods of treating coronary artery disease have prolonged life and improved functioning for millions of Americans. Medicare has made that possible in part by paying for medical care for older Americans, but also by contributing to biomedical research through its support of academic health centers, which were at the forefront of developing and testing new advances in medicine. Particularly striking in Medicare's record of success is its record in improving access to care for low-income and minority elderly Americans. It's hard to understand today that healthcare in America was racially segregated when Medicare was enacted. Racial disparities in care for elderly Americans have largely been eliminated, and Medicare was the instrumental force in spurring the desegregation of medical facilities. Medicare finances health services for some of the most vulnerable Americans. 1 in 10 Medicare beneficiaries are over age 85. 13% are disabled and under age 65. We sometimes have an image of older Americans as all out on the golf course. In fact, many have quite low incomes, and many are quite frail. 1/4 of Medicare beneficiaries are poor or near poor, and 3/4 of all elderly have incomes below $25,000. So these are quite modest income beneficiaries. Medicare is not an overly generous program. In fact, Medicare's benefits have remained relatively modest. It covers only 45% of healthcare expenses of older Americans, both because it imposes deductibles and cost sharing, and because it does not cover benefits such as prescription drugs and long-term care. As a result, older Americans today spend 21% of their incomes on health care, and low-income elderly, even with supplemental coverage from Medicaid, devote 30% of their incomes to health care expenses. In fact, the main way in which Medicare has not kept pace with the times is its benefit package. The structure of benefits is basically the same as when it was enacted in 1965, but in real terms, its deductibles and premiums are much higher today than they were in 1966. Most employer plans today include prescription drugs, they include ceilings on out-of-pocket expenses, but Medicare does not. In fact, in the generosity of its benefit package, Medicare is in the bottom 10% of insurance plans. Despite that, Medicare beneficiaries uniformly rate Medicare as satisfactory and at a much higher rate than do those covered by employer coverage. But the cost sharing that exists does fall particularly on the chronically ill and those who need extensive medical care. About 10% of Medicare beneficiaries account for about 75% of Medicare outlays, averaging $37,000 a year. For example, 60% of poor elderly have arthritis, half suffer from hypertension and need counseling about diet and exercise. Many require physician monitoring and prescription drugs to control their condition. And 12% of poor elderly people have diabetes, and many require insulin. It's why, in my view, we need to look toward improving Medicare's benefit as we look to reshaping the program for the next century, including prescription drugs, for example, such as insulin, cholesterol-lowering drugs, hormone replacement therapy medication that can help reduce the threat of heart disease, osteoporosis, and according to recent research, perhaps delay the onset of Alzheimer's, as well as pain medication for cancer patients. Low-income elderly and disabled beneficiaries increasingly rely on Medicaid to supplement Medicare. Currently, Medicaid covers all poor Medicare beneficiaries and subsidizes premiums up to 120% of poverty. However, not all poor Medicare beneficiaries find out about this benefit and get signed up, and even at this level, coverage is quite modest. The poverty level for a single elderly person is $7,500 a year. So there are only these additional benefits and subsidies for those up to about $9,000, when out-of-pocket costs now average about $2,600 per person. Medicaid and Medicare are also important financiers of long-term care, particularly Medicaid, to help those suffering with physically and mentally disabling conditions. But benefits need to be expanded in Medicare, and supplemental Medicaid protection for poor and near poor Medicare beneficiaries needs to be improved. Well, what about Medicare's costs? It's become fashionable to characterize Medicare as outmoded. In fact, Medicare has been a pioneer in incentive methods of paying healthcare providers and a model of administrative efficiency. Medicare's administrative costs average 2% of program outlays, compared with 15 to 20% in managed care plans, 35 to 50% in individual health insurance policies. Medicare has also been an innovator in provider payment. Its system of paying physicians has been increasingly accepted by physicians, despite the opposition of the American Medical Association in the beginning to the bill. Medicare provides beneficiaries with the option of traditional fee-for-service coverage, as well as from managed care plans, and in fact provides more options than most employer plans. In terms of its records of costs, Medicare costs have gone up rapidly over time, and I think that is a lot of the underlying concern. But Medicare's record mirrors that of the private sector and trends in healthcare costs nationally. Over the long run, both Medicare and private health insurance are driven by underlying trends in healthcare costs. A sustainable rate of growth in Medicare that will provide quality care for Medicare beneficiaries needs to keep up with what's happening with health technology and innovations in care. But the rising costs of health care generally, as well as the growing numbers of older people, are causing the Medicare program to increase at an annual rate of about 9%. And this is at a time when budget pressures are trying to contain the growth in the federal budget to a 4 to 5% rate of increase. These pressures and the projected insolvency of the payroll tax-financed hospital insurance part of Medicare has spawned numerous proposals to restructure the program. These proposals have taken the form of reduced payments to hospitals, physicians, managed care plans, and other healthcare providers, as well as proposals to increase beneficiary financial contributions through increased premiums or cost sharing, and incentives for beneficiaries to enroll in managed care plans. Other proposals would fundamentally alter the social insurance nature of Medicare, replacing current benefits with vouchers to purchase private insurance or managed care coverage, or vouchers to purchase private catastrophic coverage combined with tax-sheltered medical savings account. These changes all run the risk of undermining the adequacy of Medicare, the quality of care available to beneficiaries, and uncertainty about out-of-pocket medical expenses in old age, and they threaten to undermine the gains in economic security achieved by older people in the last 30 years. In the short run, certainly the oversupply of hospital beds and physicians does create opportunities for achieving modest savings through tightening of provider payment rates without serious risk of limiting their willingness to participate in Medicare. Over the long run, however, holding rates paid to hospitals, physicians, managed care plans, and other providers below rates paid by private insurers runs the risk of relocating older Americans to inferior health care. Increasing financial contributions from Medicare beneficiaries is particularly problematic. Even with Medicare, they're already devoting, as I mentioned, 21% of their incomes to health care. Suggesting that further financial contributions are unrealistic. Options to replace Medicare with vouchers raise particular concerns. They fragment older Americans into different arrangements. Those who are healthy and well-to-do are likely to be able to afford comprehensive coverage and high-quality care. But a limited voucher is likely to reduce choices for modest income older people who could not afford the difference between the value of the voucher and what it really costs for quality health care coverage. Retaining high-quality Medicare should be a top priority. Further improvements for those at the end of the economic ladder are also important. As we begin to reshape Medicare for the next century, we should improve benefits and financial protection for beneficiaries, institute prospective payment systems for all Medicare services, improve Medicare's methods of paying for managed care plans, as well as setting and enforcing quality standards, providing standardized information to beneficiaries, and manage a genuine enrollment process with genuine choices for beneficiaries. But we must also extend the solvency of the Medicare Hospital Trust Fund while beginning an in-depth examination of the merits of alternative sources of financing Medicare over the long term. What should be preserved is the essential role that Medicare plays in guaranteeing access to health care services and protecting from the financial hardships that inadequate insurance can generate for our nation's most vulnerable elderly and disabled people. No American should become destitute because of uncovered medical bills, nor be denied access to essential health care services. Medicare is a model of success. It should be strengthened and improved, and its fundamental goals of contributing to better health care and economic security in old age should be preserved as it is reshaped to meet the challenges of the next century. Thank you.
Finally, I'm proud to introduce my uncle, Senator Edward M. Kennedy. One of his proudest early votes in the Senate was for the creation of Medicare, and he continues to become one of its staunchest defenders ever since.
Thank you very much. When I first came to the Senate in 1962, the enactment of Medicare was one of my brother's highest priorities, and he understood that lack of adequate health insurance was a crushing burden for the millions of senior citizens, a burden that made a mockery of the promise of a dignified retirement under Social Security. The enactment of Medicare 32 years ago met this need, and it created a new social contract between America and the elderly, a solemn promise that if you work hard, play by the rules, and contribute to the nation, then the nation will pay the cost of your health care in your retirement years. Despite Medicare's success, its rising costs in recent years have become an excuse for an unprecedented assault by its ideological opponents on its basic guarantee. The new majority in Congress elected in 1994 tried to treat Medicare not as a promise of health security, but as a way to finance billions of dollars in tax breaks for the wealthy. In addition, they proposed other changes to force senior citizens to give up Medicare and buy private health insurance plans that would mean higher profits for the health insurance industry. Fortunately, President Clinton vetoed that attack, and the American people supported him. But the longer-term threat to Medicare is the most serious challenge, and it's rooted in changing population trends. Today, there are nearly 4 adults of working age for every senior citizen. In the next generation, with the retirement of the baby boomers, that ratio is projected to fall to about 2 workers for every senior citizen. So there'll be heavy pressure on the payroll tax that funds both Social Security and Medicare. If we do nothing, the cost projections suggest a large shortfall in the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund beginning early in the next century. If we listen to Medicare's opponents and deal with this shortfall solely by cutting benefits, we will have to cut health care services for the elderly by a full 30% to keep the program solvent for the next 25 years. Or we would have to increase the Medicare payroll tax by 40%. Longer-term projections suggest even greater gaps between costs and revenues. A better approach to Medicare's problems is being suggested in a recently published study from Duke University. Professors Ken Manton and Larry Corder and Eric Stollard show that a realistic way to make Medicare healthy is to make senior citizens healthier. Instead of looking solely at taxes and benefits, we would focus much more clearly on a third key aspect of Medicare's viability, the health of the elderly. The very ill, those so sick that they are disabled, account for the overwhelming majority of Medicare costs. Disabled senior citizens are those who are unable to perform such normal activities as bathing themselves, cooking, going to the grocery store without assistance. They are typically the victims of chronic illnesses or in generally poor health. In 1995, the average disabled senior citizen cost Medicare 4 to 7 times as much as a non-disabled beneficiary. Saving just one senior citizen from disability saves Medicare an incredible $15,000 up to $37,000 that Karen has mentioned, Davis has just mentioned. The implications of the Duke study is that if we take the sensible steps now to fix Medicare for the short term, the most effective way to keep it solvent for the long term is to maintain and modestly increase the existing trend towards better health for older Americans. Reducing the elderly's health care costs by improving their health rests on 5 central strategies. First, we must improve the dissemination and adoption of effective medical treatments, especially new treatments. Second, we must improve the delivery to the elderly of outpatient, preventive, and other health services. Third, we must encourage the elderly to adopt healthier lifestyles. Fourth, and critically important, we must dramatically increase investment in medical research. And fifth, we must improve the benefits so that the Medicare truly provides the protection it promises. The Duke study provides powerful evidence that this approach is practical. It measures the decline in disability rates among the elderly between 1982 and 1994. The rate of disability dropped by an average of 1.3% a year. If we take the current 1.3% annual decline in disability and raise it slightly to 1.5% a year, we could potentially save enough in Medicare to avoid any substantial long-term increase in the Medicare tax or the reduction in benefits. Senior citizens will enjoy longer lives. The overall savings from their better health will outweigh the additional cost of providing health care for a larger number of the elderly. Basically, what you're saying is that today, as Karen Davis is pointing out, about 80% of those under Medicare never go to the hospital over the course of the year. The burden on the Medicare is those 20%, 19%, 18% that go to the hospitals. What the Duke study says, if you reduce that number of about the 20% by 1.3%, the savings are going to be dramatic, and if you're just able to increase it to 1.5% over a year, from 1.3 to 1.5 by utilizing the kinds of 5 points that we've recommended, the impact will be two. One, the seniors will be much healthier. And secondly, the status of the healthcare, the Medicare Trust Fund, will be healthier as well. Much of the strategy for accomplishing this goal involves simple, practical steps that take advantage of resources already available. One important element is more rapid dissemination of new research findings into the general medical practice. Large numbers of patients, often as many as half, fail to receive the proper therapies, such as for asthma, high blood pressure, and for early-stage breast cancer. Interesting studies that demonstrate here from the Harvard Medical School that if they're able to get the best in terms of practices, you can far exceed these kinds of projections. 80% of the elderly heart attack patients fail to receive the needed treatment and suffer a 75% higher death rate than those treated properly. Too often, the elderly do not receive the timely outpatient and preventive care, the kind of care that can avoid higher future costs and unnecessary illness and disability. Billions can be saved if we give the preventive care the same commitment and skill we give acute care. The misuse of prescription medication is a prime example of how better outpatient care and information can deal with the larger, more costly problem. The average elderly person takes 4 to 6 different prescription drugs a day. Over 1.5 billion senior citizen prescriptions are filled each year. An estimated half of them are taken incorrectly because patients do not follow the recommended doses or because multiple drugs are prescribed improperly. The cost to the Medicare in avoidable hospitalizations and medical care is estimated at $15 billion, 8% of the total Medicare cost annually. This unnecessary cost could be reduced dramatically and the health of elderly improved if physicians prescribe drugs more carefully, better instructions to the patients, if pharmacies supply better information with the medication as well. The preventive services also hold great promise. Pneumonia and influenza cost Medicare $3 billion a year. The Centers for Disease Control recommend that all Americans over 65 receive annual immunizations. 86% of the elderly are not vaccinated against pneumonia, and only half of the elderly receive the recommended flu shots. We must also pay increasing, and you could save, if you move that up from the 15% to 85%, you'd be saving anywhere from $3 to $5 billion a year. We must also pay increased attention to lifestyle. The report calls Healthy People 2000, sets important goals and objectives, include reducing mortality from heart disease, cancer, stroke, and lung disease. Less smoking, less fat consumption can achieve a great deal. Smoke-related illnesses cost Medicare $7 billion a year. Regular exercise can reduce the heart disease, osteoporosis, and hip fractures. Greater support for medical research can make a vast difference, too. In fact, such support may well be the key to achieving the goal of protecting Medicare by reducing disability rates. One example of recent progress that also reduced costs is treatment of stroke, which attacks 3 million Americans each year at a cost of approximately $30 billion a year. Victims who receive the new clot-dissolving drug in the first hours after stroke recover more fully and quickly than other patients. In fact, half of the patients receiving this treatment recover completely. Whether the issue is Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, Parkinson's disease, osteoporosis, diabetes, or other conditions, the explosion of new research is pointing the way to better long-term health for all of our senior citizens. The promise of new medical research is boundless. As impressive as the progress the recent past has been, it pales in comparison to the opportunities for the future. We stand at the threshold of breakthrough advances in medicine through deeper understanding of the fundamental mechanisms of the cell, through the mapping of the human genome, through biotechnology, through a host of other advances that are already on the horizon. As this century has been known as the century of physics and of chemistry, it's the life sciences now, with the enormous kinds of possibility and opportunity in the areas of health generally, and most particularly in terms of the reductions on disability for our seniors. There's a good chance that the current deal can be improved to double. It will be done, the NIH funding in the next 5 years. It's an investment that we ought to make. Obviously, we need to do more to achieve better controls over the Medicare and the cost of entire health care systems. GAO estimates that as much as 10% of the Medicare expenditures are due to fraud and abuse, and that's 1/3 of the total projected shortfall in the program. We need to see that healthier services for the elderly are delivered as cost effectively. But the most important benefit of this strategy will not be making Medicare healthy, important as that is, be making senior citizens healthier so that their golden years will indeed be golden. For your parents' generation and for your generation too, when you retire, the gifts are far better health is within the reach if we're wise enough to grasp it, and in doing so, we'll also be fulfilling a major part of President Kennedy's legacy. I think these charts over here demonstrate, we'll have a chance to do that a little later, I guess. And thank you very much. Sure.
We have time for just a few questions. If anyone would like to ask one, there's 2 microphones here, and we went a little over, so we're going to be sort of constrained. So I ask you to please keep your questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Will Monahan. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question is this. I was studying for finals earlier this month when the budget deal came out, and I didn't really get a chance to analyze this, so maybe this is for Senator Kennedy or Dr. Davis. What exactly are the implications of that deal for Medicare, and more or less, do you think it was the right thing to do, or just if you could expand on what you think the policy of the administration and the deal that had to be cut with the Republicans in Congress?
The budget agreement has $115 billion savings in Medicare over a 5-year period. Most of those savings come from tightening up on what Medicare pays hospitals, physicians, and managed care plans. There's a tiny bit of premium increase, but not much, and within it there is some improved preventive services in Medicare. I think most people looking at it would think it's doable. It's real. Some people say, well, there's nothing real about this budget agreement. Those are tough cuts for providers, and they will require a lot of adjustment. They basically slow the rate of increase in Medicare to about 6.5% a year from a 9% that was projected. So that's a pretty sharp tightening. It also begins to lay the groundwork for expanding choices for Medicare beneficiaries to manage care, open enrollment so that once a year you get all the choices explained to you, some quality standards on managed care plans, and I'm a little less enthusiastic about expanding the array of plans that can participate until we get good quality standards in place, but that's there. I think that the bigger question is, what is the $115 billion going for? That's my question. It's not going to really improve benefits in Medicare. There is a commitment apparently to do a little bit of improvement in Medicaid premium subsidies for near poor Medicare beneficiaries. But for $115 billion, you could have universal coverage of kids. You could make a substantial dent in the uninsured. And in my view, it is going largely for tax cuts that benefit higher income populations. So it's not that they are cuts that are unsustainable, that'll wreak real havoc on the Medicare program. To me, is what sacrifice, who's benefiting from that sacrifice? And that's the question in my mind.
Thank you.
Great.
Joe Harrington from Cambridge. We bought lace curtains and had to move to Belmont. So I just wanted to reinforce what Ms. Davis said, that there's a conception out there that I read very often that we're greedy geezers when we're on Medicare. The average income for a woman, and many of the women are on Social Security, that's their only income, is $705 a month. Figures that I had was 78% of the people who are on Medicare, their incomes are $25,000 or less. Couple that with the fact that the doctor's share of the total health care was $200 billion, not million, billion. So we really aren't very well off. We have houses that are worth a lot of money now, but it costs a fortune to keep them up. And I just wanted to mention that we really aren't that rich a bunch of people.
Well, your numbers are basically right. 3/4 of Medicare beneficiaries do have incomes under $25,000. The average amount per person that the elderly now pay is $2,600 a person. So, and it's actually not the case that most seniors are asset rich in a house either. People with modest incomes tend to not have a lot of equity built up in their houses, and they have repair costs too to maintain houses. So, you know, during your working lifetime, you're spending 8% of a higher income on health care. Do we want to pay less during our working lifetime and then be paying a fourth, 30% of our income when it's at a much lower level when we retire?
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner, and I'm a senior, at least for a few more days, here at Harvard College. And I want to ask a question about sort of the more of a conceptual question about Medicare. In one of the sociology courses I took here at Harvard, we talked a lot about welfare and how welfare was originally designed to enable mothers particularly to stay home with their children because as a society we didn't want them in the workforce. And now we've made a full turnaround there to be thinking that it really is a matter of workfare and that we want people working for their welfare benefits. Without getting too much into the welfare issue, I'd like to know if you, particularly Mr. Ball or Senator Kennedy, see a similar type of attitude change in the Medicare program for the elderly people, or if you see that there's been a consistency in the attitude that because the elderly have given a lot to the country that they ought to be benefiting in health care in their older years, or if you could comment on those issues for me, please.
Go ahead, Bob. No, I don't think it's the same at all. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that Medicare is really not even primarily for old people. It's for their sons and daughters. They don't have enough money to pay the bills if they weren't under Medicare. And who would pay it? It's a protection by current workers. You can look at the whole program as something current workers pay to even out the risks that they have for taking care of their parents and grandparents. You could look at the whole program that way. And I don't think there is the same kind of, and never has been, the same kind of opposition or reluctance to have programs that help the retired elderly that there is about people of working age and welfare. Much to my regret. I mean, I think what's happened to public opinion and welfare is awful. It's terrible that in this country we should have really taken back the guarantee of the federal government of at least minimum support for children. And but this is a very old story. For 200 years, we've been going back and forth. There's nothing new in the welfare argument. It's all about work, services, and adequate incomes versus the great concern that maybe somebody's going to get away with something.
These microphones working?
Is there someone? Oh, we have time for 2 more questions. So.
Okay. Hi, my name is Chris Brown. I'm a master's in public administration student here at the Kennedy School. My question was about the American Medical Association's role. It was quite clear from the video that they played a largely negative role in the 1960s debate. But obviously, things turned out pretty good for them in how the program eventually was constructed. I guess what was interesting was a story in today's New York Times about the latest quid pro quo between the AMA and members of the Senate, wherein it was suggested that the AMA had supported the partial birth abortion ban last week in exchange for the Republican majority supporting their interests in the upcoming Medicare debate. I was wondering whether, given the history of Medicare and the position that the AMA has traditionally taken on Medicare issues, whether this new information will discredit them in the coming lobbying battle, and how you perceive, I guess this is a question for Senator Kennedy, how you perceive the AMA's role in this lobbying battle, and where exactly doctors will come out in this.
Well, it's, you stated the facts once they found out that they were taken care of in terms of partial birth abortion issue. They came out in terms of the support for the Santorum. It had nothing to do at that time really with the medical procedure, but just their own kind of position on liability under law. And 5 days later, we tried to get them out there on children's issues. I mean, you'd think if doctors would be out there, it's going to be $20 billion, someone's going to get paid. It's going to be the doctors, you know. You'd think not only are they caring in terms of pediatricians were out there, they were knocking down, the nurses were out there leading the fight, demonstrating in support, and we couldn't get the AMA to endorse that simple piece of legislation. We got a general kind of a statement from one of their leaders that said that this doesn't represent the total board or the position of the AMA, but as a member of the AMA leadership, we could go ahead and say that they are supporting. And here you're talking about two issues. One is in terms of the health of children, and secondly in terms of the health of children, of deterring them from smoking, after they must have passed 50 resolutions in their General Assembly deploring the smoking, the impact that that has on children. Here was the opportunity for them to take a solid position. So that is why at least many of us are really surprised. Not really surprised, because as I could listen to this, their positions on the back, and as Karen Davis remembers, and as we have been trying to debate these overarching issues in terms of the health care, we found that they have certainly not been willing. The exception of Massachusetts Medical Society has been first rate. Massachusetts Hospital Association has absolutely been superb. On both of these issues have really been leaders. So there are some very important exception, and there's certain other kinds of state agencies that really understand that they want to be able to treat a person, not looking at them and wondering how they can pay, but what their health care needs are. That's why we have always thought that the doctors would be the first that would be able to support it, because they are in that profession because they want to treat people, so they ought to be able to support this with the idea of giving that person the best and not being able to have to be considered on it. Just a final, for Avery's earlier question, you know, it's difficult to believe when I was listening to Bob Ball speak about the changes in there. In the debates on Social Security in about 1967, I believe, Robert Kennedy and Al Gore, Sr., in the Senate, offered the amendment to make sure that parents would be able to stay home up to the age of 3, and they intended to bring it up to 4 or 5, depending on the follow-on, so that they would not be denied the kinds of benefits, because how important it was for parents to be involved with the children at that time. And they missed that by about 1 vote. It was inevitable that it was going to move on the next time they came. And what a change in terms of atmosphere, where we can't wait to get a mother out of that house right after they give birth to that child, so that they'll go out and underskilled and without training, and try to get some kind of employment, leaving children at home and not providing the daycare or the other kinds of attention for those, and wonder why people are sicker, and why there's more tension and more anxiety and more frustration. We don't measure the mindset of people as well as we do the bottom line. We're masters at that in the Congress, particularly recently, and we don't measure the kinds of anxiety and the problems that mothers have when they have sick children, and the tension that it provides, and the more frustration they have in dealing with their other children. I mean, these are matters that are affecting every single family, and we don't give that really very much attention. But I would hope that we could probably shame the AMA, if we have to, into supporting it the next time after we have the votes to pass it. I think they might be.
So, last question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lisa V., and I'm a graduate student here at Harvard University Extension School. I don't know who I would pose this question to, but I was just wondering, I became disabled as a child, and unfortunately, I experienced a lack of knowledge as far as the medical profession is concerned in how to deal with me and work with me. And I was wondering, is there any funds in the future, maybe using Medicaid or Medicare, in trying to train the medical profession in dealing with people with disabilities, considering we are the largest minority group in the country?
Let me mention this. There are some, but I'll tell you what is the most hopeful sign of we have only in the recent times been willing to deal with the problems of discrimination on disability. I mean, I think part of the very strong tradition of President Kennedy was the beginning of that movement towards really helping to strike the problems of discrimination, with Dr. King opening the way in the late 1950s, starting in the 60s, and what we've done in striking down discrimination on race and ethnicity, on gender, in the most recent time, on disability, all forms of types of discrimination, and we've made some important progress, as you well know. In the legislation that Senator Jeffords and I will follow on after the children's, or we'll do it during the children's if necessary, to try and provide a consumer bill of rights so we get away from the drive-by mastectomies, drive-by deliveries, drive-by emergency when people are getting involved in HMOs. You know, we have HMOs in Massachusetts, they're good, and in our state, and conceptually, dealing with people holistically makes sense. And so the good ones and that have the best in terms of organization and structure are very, very important. I'm for. But what we're seeing is something else sweeping across the country, which says that doctors can't prescribe the kinds of attention to somebody that has a disability, keeps them away from specialists, excludes them from clinical tests, which is so important for so many people to be able to be involved with breakthrough technology and various treatments so that they can get healthier. They deny them participation, and they make especially we all are familiar with the drive-by mastectomies and deliveries and others, and the gag rules, but also about purposely excluding treatment for disabled. In the legislation, we're going to have an ombudsman that's going to be available to any of those that have special needs, and that will look at those as a case-by-case measure, and going to be reporting both in terms of the state, necessary follow-up. We'll review those measures in terms of at the federal level if we find patterns of practices in terms of any particular groups, and be able to move against them civilly if they demonstrate that. So that we're going to really, we had that in my national health insurance bill, which is another chapter at another time. But we had what they call personal attendance for those that qualified in terms of the of disability. We're going to ensure that any program that comes through there that is going to protect consumers will have an ombudsman for everyone that has special needs and special treatments, so that they will be able to receive it. That's going to be an essential part of that legislation, and we're going to look forward to working with a number of the groups to make sure we get it right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our program. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for their thoughts and comments, and members of the audience for your interest and attention. Thank you.